few quick questions about the New England Journal of Medicine piece, and it's completely informal, so just feel free to tell me exactly, how you think about it. When I look at the results, or when I read the paper initially, I was struck by how good the results were. I know you sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable that the main thing didn't come out, but I actually think that the whole 95% confidence interval is so arbitrary anyway. I mean, we could have determined that it's 94%, whatever, and then it would pass at some point. If it's 93.7, it would pass. It's completely arbitrary, just like 0.05 is arbitrary. Everything there looks like it's going in the right direction. What do psychiatrists say? The New England Journal of Medicine is not a psychiatric journal. It's a general medicine journal, but the top one. Were you hugged and embraced by the community, or was this considered like a hard-to-swallow frog, or what kind of reactions did you get? I mean, maybe it's too fresh to even tell.
I think they assumed that they would see something like this, probably, and it depends where their bias is, but most psychiatrists have spent many years prescribing SSRIs. So there was a bit of a gulp, I think, well, maybe that's my projection. But if I think about, for example, David Nutt, who's a classic psychopharmacologist, very much has rubbed shoulders with industry, pharma industry for many years, and played a major role in developing some new antidepressants. Then it was a tough one for him to wrap his head around, I think. And he was also mindful that we not get carried away with quite how good psilocybin looked. So, if you break it right down, I do think psilocybin comes out on top. Let's just say it straight. Psilocybin looks like the superior treatment in this trial, however we carve up the stats. And so I would say, if there's a reality check to take here, an important critique is to think that maybe the sample's biased. Maybe most people coming in wanted the psilocybin, and that may well have contributed to the, in my eyes, very positive results for psilocybin.
Mm-hmm. In general, do you find that results of this nature, when NEJM comes out with a result like this, does this increase credibility, or does it increase knee-jerk reaction, or does it increase both?
I'd like to think it increases credibility. On whose part, I don't know, mine or psilocybin's. We tried to be very balanced. I thought I wrote the paper and designed the trial with equipoise. You get a good dose of escitalopram, up to 20 milligrams for the final 3 weeks. You get psychotherapy as well. We matched for all the different elements. So it was a tough test for psilocybin. And then the write-up, I thought, was very balanced, and yet the paper was rewritten in a sense. The editorial writing of it was very hands-on.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the abstract and anything where there's a narrative feel. They're not, in a sense, they're not my words, But you do what you do to achieve a publication like that, and that's why I encourage people to look at the data and to not be too influenced by narratives. But I know that happens. So there's a bit of a strange personal feeling towards that paper, where I just hope people understand the findings. It's really that's the key thing for me, is look at the data, look at the charts that had to go into supplementary appendix, not because I wanted them to, because I was asked that they go in. So it's a funny one, because I'm also conscious I don't want to sound sore because we got a New England Journal of Medicine article. But for me, it's very, very important that people see the results and digest the results. And I just wonder whether there was some editorial nervousness that, oh my goodness, psilocybin therapy, a psychedelic, looks better than a conventional antidepressant that's worth, billions of dollars. I don't know.
Well, I mean, take into account the fact that, you've got 10%, if not more, people in this country on antidepressants. And And if we're looking at particular age brackets, let's say women above 45, let's say it's even more than 10%. And then the question becomes, what should all these people think? I mean, should they throw away their antidepressants and SSRIs and run for psilocybin? I mean, what do you think is this likely to do to the average patient?
Well, I think it will pique their interest, and I think that they're interested, and they should be in a sense, and maybe it puts another spin, a fresh spin. Maybe it shines a light on what they've been doing, and maybe there are treatments that could be better for them than the ones that they've been on for a while, and they get to understand the effects of what they've been on for a while. And people should always be able to operate in an informed way, to be empowered with information. And so that's why I feel really good about the trial and the results, so long as they can get communicated well enough.
Part of the reason that I ask you these things is because I've been embedded in psychiatry department most of my adult life. Cornell Psychiatry, Columbia Psychiatry, McGill Psychiatry, and I've done research that showed unequivocally, as far as I was concerned, through meta-analysis, through other techniques, that antidepressants are statistically significant, slightly in a slightly better. Okay, let me rephrase. Antidepressants compared to placebos have a slightly better, statistically significant, slightly better effect, but not clinically better. In other words, it doesn't really make a big difference whether you give a placebo or an antidepressant clinically. There's a small statistically significant effect there, but it's not clinically significant. In the same way that, if we did, a study and I showed you that, people who smile, can live, 10 seconds more than people who don't smile. If I take 1 million people and I do this study, I would reach statistical significance at some point, because it's very sensitive to the sample size. But clearly, it doesn't have any clinical significance. Those 10 seconds. This is, by the way, an example that Irvin Kirsch came up with a long time ago. The question is, when we show clinical significance, and you show clinical significance in this study, I mean, this is not just statistical significance. There's clinical significance there.
Yes.
Should people not listen very carefully, as opposed to, just looking at, statistically significant data, which is sort of the difference between, does this have applied value? Can this work in the real world? Does this have impact in real life, versus this has some kind of an academic impact?
Yeah, it's things like that make me value the absolute outcomes, and so by that I mean response rate, and probably even more to the point, remission rates, because you can communicate them quite easily. What's remission? It's you don't have the disorder anymore. Your symptom severity is so low that you wouldn't meet a diagnosis for depression. You're in remission. And those remission rates, even in the most conservative measure, or the measure that performed the least well in this trial, which was the QIDS, the primary outcome measure, remission rates are twice as high. You're twice as likely to be free of your depression from psilocybin. So if people hear that, it has very real world relevance. They know what it means. They don't have what's this statistical significance? They don't have to understand the science to understand that. But we play the game, and the game has certain rules. I think that's useful for people to hear.
When I talk to, I mentioned it to you earlier in this morning when we spoke, but when I mention, for example, the fact that we are comparing antidepressants to psychedelic, it doesn't matter if it's psilocybin or something else, but when I talk about these comparisons, they always say to me, well, don't show me, antidepressant versus, let's say, psilocybin with therapy. Show me antidepressant versus psilocybin. Because they're thinking about it through the lens of what is the drug effect, or what is the drug response. They're not interested in the package and because they're trying to distill sort of the chemical effect, if there is one, according to them. And this, becomes more of a question of philosophical therapeutics here. because I think that the model that is advanced through psychedelic treatment is quite different from the model that comes through with antidepressants. Do you want to maybe say a few things about that?
Yeah. I mean, psychedelic therapy is paradigm challenging on a number of levels, whether it's the nature of the action, that it's a combination treatment, so it's not just a drug. We are making the assumption that something happens in synergy with the drug and the therapeutic context that is much more than either on their own. So either drug or either psychotherapy on its own. And that's there isn't really a clear other example for that, I think, in psychiatric practice, unless I'm missing something. And then the paradigms around testing as well. Basically, we had to fit psychedelic therapy into this, it's a square peg in a round hole. We're having to fit it into the drug versus placebo model that you're referring to. And that's the gold standard way of testing, but that's loaded with assumption. And maybe those assumptions aren't so robust. So one assumption would be that the blind is upheld in drug versus placebo studies, that the blinding works and people don't know what they're on, but I think that assumption is really questionable, and very rarely do people in these trials actually measure the patient's guess before the blind is broken, whether for placebo or drug. And if they were to, they'd probably get a shock, because they'd probably find that most people work it out, particularly for the active condition. I mean, there are some studies that have done this and have found correct guess rates as high as 80%.
Very few, actually. Very few studies.
Very few, isn't it? And why? Why? Maybe because the blinding isn't integrous and doesn't hold up. And if it doesn't hold up, what's happening here? Some kind of charade, It's not this robust test where it's all the drug doing the action. There's a big dollop of psychology coming in here that's influencing outcomes.
In the studies that looked at these things carefully, they saw that even the physicians who are supposed to be blind to giving the drug can actually guess quite accurately who's getting it and who's not. So that would, of course, influence something maybe subconsciously about the treatment that they give, or the interactions that they have, the communications that they have with these patients, when they know, or when they sort of second guess or subconsciously infer that this person is actually getting the drug. There might be something different about the therapeutic encounter.
And then there's a ton of biases, subtle biases, but they're there, whether they're publication biases or, what about the ratings? Those ratings are often being done by clinicians. They might be independent, but when they're doing an interview to do their rating, clues are popping up all the time about, oh, okay, I think they're in the drug condition, and then the funding. A lot of the funding is coming from industry. So a number of different biases there.
In terms of the way that you see the future of psychiatry as a researcher, obviously not as a clinician, but as a researcher, do you think that it's inevitable that psychedelics would triumph, assuming that more studies like that are going to come out? And the reason I ask is because, as you know, or I should say as I know, sometimes it's not the science that prevails. It takes a long time for certain things to trickle out. There's market forces, there's big pharma, there's politics, policy making, there's all kinds of issues at work here that sometimes make a difference. Do you think that if more information came out, the psychiatric community is going to, or we're going to change its ways very quickly and sort of embrace these things? Or because there are many cultural kind of hurdles to negotiate here.
There are, aren't there? And you could look to medicinal cannabis, and in the UK, where I'm from, medicinal cannabis, even though it's opened up, it can be prescribed legally. Doctors aren't prescribing it because of the cultural baggage, because of anxiety about, risks, whether imagined or otherwise. And could a similar thing happen with psychedelics, that they get a license, but doctors aren't prescribing them, and that would be a shame. So it's difficult to guess how it'll go, because I know my echo chamber that's very optimistic about the potential of psychedelic therapy. I would hope, and this will sound a bit sort of loose and lofty, that the right thing happen, like the truth will out kind of thing. That could be just very, very naive. But I think what the right thing would be is informed people able to make their own choice based on what information they have and what they want. And so that might mean that somebody suffering from depression wants an SSRI. They want the edge to be taken off things. They don't have to be told that, well, that's some cop out, oh, you're a coward, you can't handle psychedelic therapy. I think people should just have that choice, and so that would be great, if they are presented with these options and there's enough education so they can understand the options and then choose.
I wanted to take the conversation in a slightly more consciousness direction. Many of the research projects that we have here are concerned either directly or indirectly with consciousness, not just the neural correlates of consciousness, but sometimes things that are related to mechanisms of action, or what kind of measurables can we have to determine if something is conscious or not, or how to even theorize about these concepts. And psychedelics really are changing the landscape in a big way, because if on the one hand, we have theoreticians, sometimes even from quantum physics, people who are coming and saying, oh, this is entanglement and, blah, blah. And other people who are saying this is information theory and I don't, take these theoreticians lightly. I just don't always understand them. But here we're talking with something that is super tangible, palpable, empirical, measurable. People come, they take a particular substance, they ingest it, and as a result of that, in a relatively short period of time, they're able to report, first of all, change their behavior and report really sensation and perception changes that are very deep, that sometimes would change their lives going forward in a very, big way. Do you think that we're doing enough as a research community to embrace what psychedelics are offering to the study of consciousness?
Not really. I think we could do much more. Psychiatry has embraced psychedelic science more quickly and readily than cognitive neuroscience, for example, has, probably because there's a great need for new treatments in psychiatry, and doctors, by and large, want to treat their patients better. So if they see some great outcomes, they're interested and they want to know more. In cognitive neuroscience, it's been more of a challenge because, I don't know, maybe it's less obvious to see why these compounds are interesting, short of having a personal experience. And that's the challenge. And so I've been looking forward to the day when I can present brain imaging findings that make a cognitive neuroscientist who doesn't know the actual experience with a psychedelic look at those findings and say, wow, I just don't see patterns like that. I don't see dynamics like that. I've never seen alpha drop like that, or levels of complexity increase like that, or these frontoparietal networks disintegrate like that. And maybe we're on the cusp of that. I hope so, and maybe they might look at other, inducers like meditation and other things, and that's their way in. But those states are less robust and reliable at inducing those
and it's
big
interesting
effects.
that you mentioned meditation, because I remember when I was, I forget now if I was a postdoc or but thereabouts, like at the beginning of my scientific career, Mind and Life, which is one of these organizations that is promoting meditation and contemplative practices and so on and their effects on the brain, basically went out of their way to invite a whole bunch of neuroscientists from all over to their workshops for free, and they sort of taught them meditation and gave them sessions and workshops and trainings and they fed them, they covered their stay and all these things. I wonder if it makes sense to do the same thing with psychedelics. I wonder if it makes sense to sort of create opportunities for people, major scientists, major clinicians, to come to retreats, to scientific conferences, points of contact where they can actually experience these things, because I think it's very difficult to be moved by this by reading a paper. I think that some of these things are experiential, and it's very difficult to grab people, just like, it's very difficult to, for example, communicate the taste of a banana. It's much easier to just, take a bite and you can philosophize about it until the cows come home. I mean, we can sit here and talk about the shape of the banana, the texture, and the consistency, and the kind of imagery that and at the end of the day, it's much easier to just take a banana, peel it, and and take a bite. So would it make sense, do you think, to appeal to a slightly more visceral approach, where the scientific community is introduced into this by making it some kind of initiation by fire?
I think it's a fascinating idea, and it would be an interesting one. It just has to be done right. So, you wouldn't want to be too reckless with it, with too many people, with no screening and so on. You wouldn't want any adverse events through too many people in the same space tripping on too high a dose of a psychedelic. But if you do things professionally and think it through, I think it's a really exciting idea. And yes, it may well be what makes the difference in terms of inspiring people's interest. And one way to articulate it is that you don't know. It's hard to really know why something, is interesting, or even that something is there unless it's taken away. And so the quality of consciousness that we have in normal waking consciousness, experienced through this analytical mind, doing all this talking that I'm doing right now, and these easy assumptions about what's what, this kind of underlying confidence and assuredness about what's what, and then you take a psychedelic and it all breaks down. I mean, your sense of self, it's an illusion. You didn't even fathom that you can have a quality of waking consciousness that's like that. It's dramatically different. Yet you're not asleep. You're just as awake as you are now, if not more awake in some sense. And how do you could read about that stuff, you can meditate all you like, but it took the Buddha quite a lot of training until he had his experience. So there's something to be said for experience. Of course, there's an overshoot in terms of solipsistic thinking, where you think the only reality is my experience reality, but that's an overshoot, But
before we started this interview, I spoke to you off camera a little bit about how I think that the impact of trade books, for example, is underappreciated by academics, because we so much focus on the university presses and scientific papers and so on, and most people don't read those. It's not because they're not intelligent; it's just because they're not. This is not the source that they go to for reading. Most people. The same thing is true for other experiences that we have. I think that especially today, with science being a little bit under attack by politicians, by conspiracy theorists, by social media, by whatever. So for example, if I wanted to promote, and I'm speaking now as a theoretical construct, but if I wanted to promote the effect of let's say microdosing on, and bring it to the attention of people, I would do something that is, or I would think about doing something that is quite extravagant, like, for example, going to, I don't know, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and offering them to play a particular piece when all the players there are, are microdosing, or going to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and doing like sort of the same thing, and letting the audience choose, if they hear a difference, letting them make the decision, so you can then interview the players, you can speak to a whole bunch of musicians, you can speak to the people who performed, you can speak to the audience, you can speak to the conductor. Do you understand? Like I think that if we do it this way, it becomes a little bit more involved, and it's less about, is it good for you, is it bad for you? It's like you can show how it works into the fabric of culture and into this I would say spectrum or mosaic of our life.
Yeah, I think maybe things like that were happening naturally in the 60s with things like the Beatles turning on.
That's right. Lucy in the Sky.
And I think microdosing is the cultural phenomenon that's taken off both sides of the Atlantic, but perhaps particularly in the States, at least certain parts of the States. And there it's an easy way in, isn't it? It's lower doses. You don't have to have a mind-shattering big blowout on a big dose of LSD. This is low doses, and so that's been a kind of, it's like getting in the bath slowly, dipping your toe in. And that's interesting, and whether it's a real phenomenon or not, whether the lower, very low doses, tiny doses are really doing anything above placebo is a very valid question, and the current science suggests that a lot of the effect is positive expectancy, the essence of the placebo response. But still, it's an interesting phenomenon, and it is probably serving as an introduction for many people to
Yeah,
psychedelics.
I mean, I think that, again, if to use the analogy of music, and in this regard, microdosing to me is like playing very, very softly, like playing pianissimo. There's a limit to how much pianissimo you can play, because at some point you just stop hearing it. So you listen to it, and at some point it just disappears. You can't detect the sound. The signal is not there anymore. When you're talking about playing fortissimo, if you're talking about playing loudly, there's no end, because you can just play louder and louder and louder and louder, and technically you can just go to some kind of an infinite end. But when you're speaking about dosing, if as you come down, there comes a point where it's subclinical, or there comes a point where you don't feel it anymore. It's too dilute, it's too meaningless. And that's where I think it's important for us as scientists to sort of tease apart not just placebo effects, because placebo effects sometimes a dirty term that sort of encompasses a little bit too much or too many things. But I'm really interested in potentiation effects, facilitation effects. For example, how a very, very small dose can actually have an effect if given the right conditions to thrive, or given the right conditions to transcend. I sometimes use that word. That's why I'm very interested and very curious about your opinion about, for example, using microdosing with float pods, using microdosing with meditation, and so on, where I think that there's more potential. And again, going back to the model that you mentioned, that it's very rare to look at psychedelics on their own. You usually need to have psychedelics together with some kind of a psychological intervention. It's some kind of a package of the psychedelic substance together with a psychological platform. And I'm looking for basically new platforms that would go with these age-old substances.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating question. What are the best platforms? And the float tanks seem to, at least anecdotally, until there's some clear evidence on it, seem to be conducive to potentiation. And why should that be? If sensory stimulation is deprived, there's not much coming in, there's no tethering to sensory stimulation, then why do you feel the drug more? Is a fascinating question. I guess the drug is about taking the weighting of prior assumptions away to let, in a sense, endogenous information percolate up and come into conscious awareness. We often think, it's just information coming from without and then received, but what about information within that can be, in a sense, received, and experienced? So I think that might be where the potentiation lies. And other containers or platforms may share some similarities in being subtle and implicit. Music, are you ever really sort of analytically processing, all the different notes? It's much more of a passive sort of surrender to this way of being carried by the music, and so it's sort of implicit, it's action, it's subtle, and that kind of coaxing of states is probably where the potentiation is going to be most effective, I think.
Mm-hmm. How do you view the relationship between psychedelic substances and suggestibility, or the impact or the influence that these substances have on our ability to be influenced? One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between psychedelic substances and suggestibility, what it does to our ability to be influenceable, susceptible, both the therapeutic effects of these things in our self I would say, design or self-change and plasticity and how we view ourselves and the changes that we can instigate internally, but also in terms of our ability to relate to other concepts, other issues, openness, I would call it sometimes, the ability to accept others, to think like others on the on the cusp of theory of mind, even. What is your take on the relationship between these substances and suggestibility, human suggestibility?
Well, the first thing to say is that there is some evidence that psychedelics increase suggestibility. There's evidence from the historical work in the 60s, and then the hiatus happened, and now the modern human research, there's evidence again of increased suggestibility. We used hypnotic suggestibility with LSD and found a potentiation there. So it then, demands or raises this next question of what are the mechanisms there? And I suspect it's something being taken away, that maybe in terms of learning and sponging up some kind of cue, or suggested thing, we can get in the way of that at times, through critical thinking or being kind of, sort of resistant to what's being proposed, or we overthink things, a lot of ways in which our modern sort of analytical mind, in a sense the adult mind, can get in the way of a kind of learning process, really. Whereas children don't show that, they're sponges and they're hyper suggestible. The placebo effect is massive in kids. And so there, the filter's been lifted, or the filter hasn't developed yet, and they're open to being led with, suggestion. And there's an interesting paper, it's quite a few years old now, I think, of the title is something like "A little prefrontal cortex or a little frontal cortex goes a long way." Like, it's easy to think of, and there's this popular kind of somewhat of a myth in neuroscience, I think, that the human is different because of our expanded prefrontal cortex. Particularly, it's not so specific. It's much more of high level cortex that's actually spread out, that is expanded in humans. But that principle of the newest aspect of human brain actually being something that gets in the way of learning is an interesting idea. And I think the evidence, some of the latest neuroscientific evidence looking at the brain under psychedelics suggests that top-down influence is being lifted, is being lightened under the psychedelics. So that might explain things.
Do you recommend, or can you see a situation where psychedelics would be used with the teenagers and adolescents, or do you think that's, or even pediatric populations, or do you think that's something that is a little bit too sensitive to broach?
Certainly a sensitive one. I mean, any intervention in young people is sensitive. With psychedelics, you might say, well, they're already, that they're quite open already often, but then when psychopathology develops, they're closing often, so maybe a case could be made for benefit over risk in such scenarios. I think the risks are maybe elevated a bit in young people, given things like vulnerabilities to psychosis, psychotic disorders in the teenage years, in adolescence. We do have some data looking at adolescents specifically, some relatively big data, survey data, but not just retrospective data, prospective, looking at people before and after psychedelic use. And then we looked at a subsample meeting criteria for adolescents, so that's up to age 25, I think it is. And we found, generally speaking, consistent effects with what we see in adults, so improvements in certain domains of mental health, like well-being, psychological well-being, improvements. But the nature of the experience and the mediators of those outcomes was slightly different. In adults, we see this rule that the bigger the ego dissolution under the psychedelic, the bigger the improvement in the mental health outcome. Whereas in the adolescence, that mediation wasn't so robust. Suggestive, this is somewhat kind of, inferential leaping here, but maybe in the young mind and young brain, an ego isn't well formed enough to safely break it down under a psychedelic and then, see it come back and that be experienced as a positive therapeutic thing. But in an adult that perhaps has more of the capacity to have that experience and come back from it safely, that seems to be the model. But so there's just that I think sensible question as to whether that therapeutic effect is a little riskier in a young brain and mind.
In modern psychiatry, we basically, it's a bit of a caricature, but when, let's put it this way, when a psychiatry resident goes through training, it's almost like looking at a caricature where they're trained to choose from 3 types of medication for their patients, either a stimulant, or an antipsychotic, or an antidepressant. That's usually what most psychiatrists would offer you, either a stimulant, antipsychotic, antidepressant. We just covered the antidepressants and showed that, although it's a backbone drug in psychiatry, it's not so effective, or not as effective as we once thought. I'm not going to talk about the stimulants and the antipsychotics here, but do we not miss a bottle? Do we not need another category, which would be psychedelic drugs, the category that most shamans and other traditional healers sometimes go to so profoundly, and that's a question that I ask my psychiatry colleagues, and I'm not getting any clear answers. I'm getting what I usually get is either a silence of sorts or some evasive maneuver.
Well, some psychiatrists will wonder why a class of drugs, the psychedelics that work on the serotonin system in a particular way, are doing it in a way that's actually the opposite of what antipsychotics do. And they could look at that and think, well, this is dangerous. We usually block this receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. Now you're stimulating it, or this isn't a model I'm used to, I'm not comfortable with this. But that model that's dominated psychiatry has been one of sort of symptom amelioration, taking the edge off symptoms. Antipsychotics are pretty hard-hitting drugs that kind of mollify people and really take the like an antidepressant takes the edge off affect. This is an even blunter tool, knocking, in a sense, out certain aspects of cognition.
It became a bit docile.
Yeah. And okay, that's managing their symptoms now, but again, are they really living? It's a tricky territory, isn't it? But so basically, this other bottle is a very challenging bottle, and it's not one that fits the usual model of take a pill once a day, and this will help you out. It's more like take a pill once every blue moon with some very thorough psychotherapy around it, and we'll work on the core of your suffering and how it developed and your understanding of yourself and your history and so on. So that's going to take a little while, I think.
Now with Corona, we have a lot of interactions against, around the issue of remote schooling. Kids are not going to school, people are not going to work, the social interactions are virtual, flat, screen-based. It takes a social toll, it takes a mental toll on people. Does that not make the opportunity, the timing, more amenable to a psychedelic revolution? Does it not make it more unifying and slightly more, I would say, compassion building at a time when people are experiencing divisiveness that is, driven by political powers and things of that nature? Do you not see it as a special moment in the ripple of our social existence that would actually welcome this kind of intervention?
Maybe. What one would hope so. But in the same context, maybe you have conditions that are conducive to, I don't know, conspiratorial thinking, and it doesn't necessarily go in that positive direction. I wish it did. Maybe on average, we can hope that it does. I have heard that people are using psychedelics in a different way. A lot of people are growing their own. I've actually heard that sales of grow kits of magic mushrooms have gone up at least threefold. I heard that from someone actually selling them, and yet numbers of people going to psychedelic ceremony retreats have of course dropped because there's no tourism, because you can't travel. So the nature of use has changed. I think there's some data that overall use has increased, and the use will be different. It will be home use. And so there are opportunities for coming into that space and educating that kind of use, maybe providing some resources that could be online, because that's the medium we have right now, through things like musicians that are play music that's conducive to psychedelic therapy, playing live to larger numbers of people. Things like that are happening. You have a new album coming out from the artist John Hopkins called Psychedelic Therapy. East Forest he's already got his music for mushrooms, and he's developing other music that's intended, consciously to be supportive of psychedelic therapy processes, and he's played live to people. And there are other, I know that these technologies exist because I'm part of developing them, apps that are intended to educate people on best practice with psychedelic use, motivated by principles of harm reduction. If people are going to take matters into their own hands, then it's best that they do it in an informed way, to know the risks and the pitfalls, so to know how to navigate them. So it's changed, changed the nature of a lot of things, but maybe challenged a lot of our assumptions, and that's kind of conducive to these major changes. So I hope that the changes can be positive, and maybe maybe I have some degree of responsibility to try and shepherd this opportunity in a positive way.
What do you see as the next big thing in psychedelic research? What do you see as the things that are coming down the pike and are going to be the major big ticket items?
The legalization, decriminalization, so policy change.
Those are sort of happening already, some of them.
They're happening subtly, but the actual opening up of legalization isn't happening yet. It was just, or at least it hasn't happened yet. And we're in 2021 right now. Those kind of changes are going to be happening sort of late 2022 at the earliest, and so there'll be another inflection point, because that is the scaling up of psychedelic use on a infrastructural level. Infrastructure changes everything, and so I think we'll learn a lot in that process around the real nature of risks, but also opportunities. So that's a big change. I could speak to the science, but I think that's a very real world change that we're on the cusp of.
Mm-hmm. So you are at an interesting point in your career where you're sort of transitioning from Europe to Northern California. Do you obviously you see how major universities, not just UCSF, but major universities are devoting resources to psychedelic centers and psychedelic research and so on. What does that mean to the academic landscape? Does it mean that it's a nice decorative feather, or does it mean that there's actually good academic medical interest in these things?
Well, we're starting to see a crossover into the mainstream, meaning that the most prestigious journals are now publishing psychedelic research, and that hasn't been happening historically. The major funding bodies, there's just been a NIDA grant awarded for psychedelic research. That hasn't been happening historically. UK MRC and other funding bodies in the UK is starting to show a bit more interest, NIHR, and I hope that we start to see NIH grants coming in for psychedelic therapy. That would be the real, real kind of bellwether of change. Um, Academics are starting, major influential figures in academia are starting to really show an interest. So, I hope we are seeing real change and not just some kind of decorative thing. It feels substantial.
The reason I ask is because we sort of went through the same thing with meditation in a way, right? I mean, there was a whole kind of rekindling of meditation, and people started, opening meditation spas, and you would have these meditation retreats, and there was a lot of research into meditation and what it does to the brain and to the cortices and to the thicknesses of the, of slices and so on. And it began to die out at some point. It was like a wave that is sort of, faded. And do you think, or can you conceive of a situation that this would follow the same trend? We sort of experienced it a little bit with what happened here in the 60s.
Well, absolutely. It's the way of all things that the excitement, it bubbles up and it inflates, then it pops a bit and it corrects. And so that will happen with psychedelics. The key question is when, like where are we on this upward trajectory? And I really don't think we're at the peak yet. I think we've got many years to go before the bubble bursts. It will burst, there'll be a correction, but it's some way off. So I mean, personally I feel like we're riding a wave right now and the wave's still building.
So you make a distinction between ketamine, which is now approved, FDA approved for some psychiatric treatments, suicidality, depression, and so on. I think most people don't quite understand that ketamine is not a classical psychedelic. They sort of lump everything under the same roof, and most people also don't fully understand that ketamine used to be used by veterinarians mostly for horse anesthesia, and now today with slightly different dosages is being used psychiatrically. But what with so many substances being thrown around, if it's peyote and psilocybin and LSD and ayahuasca and so on and so forth, iboga and so on, what does the average person need to know without being a psychopharmacologist, without being like an expert? What do they need to know about the difference between a classic psychedelic and other things?
Yeah, I suppose the main message is that all these drugs are different. I mean, sometimes I give a talk and people ask me about cannabis, and I said, well, I'm not a cannabis expert. Why are you asking me about cannabis? And they think drugs of misuse. You must know about cannabis because you know about psychedelics. But they could be asking me a bit about, any kind of psychoactive drug, really. And I know a little bit, but not that much. And so, ibogaine has a different pharmacology to classic psychedelics. Ketamine has a very different pharmacology. Yeah, there are some similarities, very broadly speaking. They alter conscious experience in profound ways. But classic psychedelics, that's why I quite like a crisp pharmacological explanation that says you need to have direct serotonin 2A receptor agonism for a drug to be a classic psychedelic. And then the phenomenology is just a way of kind of embellishing on that. So these drugs are different, and what the domains of overlap are, we could talk about. Plasticity may be one common domain. Ketamine has been shown to promote neuroplasticity, but then ketamine abuse is associated with some neurotoxicity.
Mm-hmm.
So like all these things, there are qualifiers and to rules. And then we have compounds like MDMA, which is psychedelic-like or pseudo-psychedelics. You'll hear some very influential people argue that MDMA is a psychedelic. I don't think it is.
Well, I think that having MAPS sort of promote MDMA as their drug of choice for the studies that they're doing has a tremendous effect on their public visibility and on what most people think about MDMA, because most people do not crack open pharmacology texts, and they basically go by what they see in the news. Mm-hmm. And if this is the poster child of psychedelic drugs as far as they can see, then let it be it. So most people don't quite see the differences. I think my understanding is that when I interact with people, they don't quite see the differences between psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, MDMA. They don't understand things like toxicity and things of that nature. These are way too technical.
Yeah. I just wonder whether their understanding, whether we can just accept that, or whether we compromise on understanding if we just go too easily with that. So, people can make mistakes and maybe get into trouble if they take that too literally. I mean, MDMA is called an entactogen and empathogen. People refer to it as more heart opening than head opening. I think that's useful. I just think a little bit more time to go into a little bit of the detail will benefit people. And I would say MDMA is psychedelic-like. And, when I'm feeling relaxed, I'll say, yeah, go on then, you can call that psychedelic if you want. The psychedelic soul revealing, is it really that? And I'm not sure. Not so potently, not so reliably as a compound like psilocybin.
Today in most colleges around the U.S. at least, I'm not sure what's happening in Europe, but many college students would have opportunity to experiment with psychedelic drugs in one constellation or another. Very similar to experimenting with alcohol, very similar to experimenting with sex, very similar to experimenting with many things. It's almost like a young man's territory. And it's part of the growing up ritual. These young individuals are going outside of their homes for the first time. Usually they live in communities of similar-minded individuals, and they experiment. Some of these experiments would shape their consumption or their behavior for the future. Do you think that colleges, do you think that universities should do something about that, get proactive about it, and rather than let it happen, maybe very similar to Dance Safe, like create some kind of a program that would allow certain very similar to what you're planning to do with your app, for example, for responsible communication of information for people who are interested in engaging in these kind of ingestions and so on.
Well, I think that's another great idea. A bit like sex education, you're doing it, to promote responsibility and safety. And I think it's a similar principle here. I can only see good outcomes from that. The arguments around harm reduction, that it's not promoting of use, it's educating safe use, and it's keeping people safe. And these are young adults that are very well educated by the nature of the fact that they're going to college, and they are maturing, but they can take this information and they may well already know more about these compounds than, say, their parents. So they're ripe for it. They're ripe for education. So I think it's a very good idea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I am thinking that it would actually be the responsibility of colleges to offer these kind of things, either not necessarily through coursework, not necessarily through like a formal syllabus kind of building, but through maybe university services, and having just like you have health services that the university offers, they would offer information about psychedelic drugs and just like you said, safe sex and things of that nature. Just like they would give you earplugs and so on, they would give you also information about if you are very keen on going and experimenting with psychedelic drugs, here is what you need to know.
And in the UK we have Freshers' Fair. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent is in the US, but first come to university, there's all these events and all these different groups and societies that you can join. We are seeing psychedelic societies at a number of universities around the world now, and not just universities but in cities, and so I think that's very welcome. And if they are are well educated themselves, the people managing these societies, then that's a great opportunity for educating people and promoting harm reduction.
So the last thing that I wanted to discuss with you, sort of as part of this interaction, is to maybe get your feel on what you think is happening here in terms of industry and in terms of high tech, in terms of money making possibilities. So we have a number of investors, a number of people with money who see the psychedelic world as an opportunity to cash in with some ideas, commercial ideas, and all kinds of companies that are popping up. Do you have any particular thoughts on that, and how scientists should or shouldn't interact with these kind of trajectories?
Well, because I've seen what has been referred to as a shroom boom happening, people talked about the green rush with cannabis, and now something similar is happening with psychedelics. In a sense, I've got a better sense of the system that we live in. I've got a better sense of capitalism, both in terms of the opportunities that it can bring and how it can float development and progress, but also its limitations. And so maybe the limitations seem to me to have to do with kind of like exploitation and selling hope in a sort of exploitative way, going a bit like with science, kind of going beyond the evidence and appealing to value and implied possibilities rather than actual ones, getting ahead of things, and I guess benefiting from people's forecasting in that way. But it's a dangerous game, and it's the creation of those kind of bubbles that eventually burst and can lead to a correction that can hurt people. They've lost money. So there are principles there that apply generally to capitalism, I think, and there's good and bad, I think, to that model. I would hate to see a intervention that is at the moment and in essence spiritual in nature, holistic, deep, very human, be co-opted by exploitative forces and become some kind of monster of its true self. Could that happen? I don't know. There's a lot of well-intentioned people in the space who are trying to kind of marshal the whole development and regulate it in some way, and I hope that continues. So we'll wait and see. But again, a bit like with science, let's not get too ahead of the data and the evidence and the process. But otherwise, money coming in, I think, is to be welcomed because it's driving the progress.
Mm-hmm. Can you see a future situation where, let's say, music departments or art departments or film schools and stuff like that would actually encourage their students to experiment with psychedelic drugs as part of their creativity profile, as part of their ability to think about, construct, get out of their comfort zone, and so on?
Possibly. I mean, the promotion should never be too forceful. Maybe more just education, openly talking about things, sharing information is a healthier way, and then leaving it up to individuals as to whether they want to go there or not.
So the question is, can you see a situation where departments, divisions that really celebrate creativity and originality, music departments, art departments, film schools, and so on, would actually engage in some kind of encouragement for students to experiment or to explore the use of psychedelics?
So I think if people are given the information, and if the science is saying that certain domains of creative thinking, like divergent thinking, coming up with novel associations, whether that can be promoted through psychedelic experiences, or maybe some kind of creative block that can be broken down through psychedelics. If there's evidence that backs that, and that's communicated to people actually doing creative production, then why not? It's just communicating science. And then should they be encouraged to actually go there? Well, I don't know about encourage. Maybe just share the information, say read the book or watch the documentary, and then it's up to you. But I think that's the right way. That's the kind of informed consent.
So when we do when we educate people for critical thinking, for example, or when we educate people for safe sex. We do more than just say, here's the information and you can do with it whatever you want. We actually give it a ringing endorsement of sorts. It sounds like because of the precarious situation that we're in as scientists, and also because of the ethics that shrouds, many of these things, we have to be very careful with what we say. We cannot be interpreted as encouraging a particular behavior or as recommending it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when you know that this behavior is going on anyway, is it not our ethical responsibility to encourage it in a certain way?
Well, I think we have a responsibility to encourage best practice. Yes, I think there lies responsibility. But actually encouraging the activity itself might be overstepping things, because I don't want to pretend that there's no risk with taking a psychedelic, or that they're not as potent and just frankly, unusual as they are, these psychedelic experiences, shockingly so sometimes. And to say to young people in a way that could trivialize that, yeah, go for it, it's going to boost your creativity, it's going to make your well-being go through the roof, because there is a chance that they could have a really tough time and think, what the hell, what was Michael Pollan saying in his book, or what's all this hype about? That was awful, that was hellish. And that could happen. So I think educating is the right way. There are analogies we could draw left, right, and centre, but at the end of the day, psychedelics are psychedelics, and there are some risks. So I think education is the best way, and I would stop short of actually actively encouraging the use itself.
Great. Robin, thank you so much
Thanks,
for
Amir.
being here
Pleasure.
today. Take care.